carrying sharp ice through the empty streets of Chicago's lower district. Streetlights flickered weakly beneath the storm, their pale glow barely visible through the endless white. It was the kind of night where nobody stopped for strangers. The kind of night where survival came first. Daniel Carter stood alone in his kitchen staring at the microwave timer counting down his frozen dinner. 38 years old. Divorced. No children. No family left who called anymore. Just silence. That was what winter always reminded him of. The house creaked softly as wind slammed against the windows. Daniel rubbed tired fingers across the stubble on his jaw, already dreading another long night alone. Then, 3 hard knocks hit the front door. Daniel frowned instantly. Nobody visited him, especially not during storms like this. For a second, he considered ignoring it. But something about those knocks felt wrong. Urgent. Desperate. The kind of sound people made when they had nowhere else left to go. Slowly, Daniel crossed the living room and opened the door, then froze. Snow had piled across the porch, and lying in the middle of it was a baby, not human. Daniel's breath caught sharply in his throat. The tiny infant was wrapped in soaked blankets, trembling violently against the cold. Soft blue skin glowed faintly beneath the porch light, while 2 enormous golden eyes stared up at him with terrified exhaustion. Alien. Velari. Daniel had only seen them on old war broadcasts years ago. Refugees from the destroyed worlds beyond Earth. The baby let out a weak cry. Tiny clawed fingers curled helplessly against the frozen fabric. And something inside Daniel cracked instantly. His eyes lifted beyond the porch. That was when he saw her. The mother stood half-hidden in the storm several feet away. Tall, thin, barely standing. Long black hair clung wetly to her face while snow gathered across her shoulders. Her golden eyes locked onto the child with a fear so raw it made Daniel's stomach twist painfully. She looked starved. Not just hungry. Starved. The kind of starvation that hollowed out a person from the inside. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Daniel understood. She hadn't abandoned the child. She had been trying to save her. His jaw tightened. How many doors had she knocked on tonight? How many humans had looked at her child and slammed the door anyway? The baby whimpered again. Daniel bent down instinctively and lifted her into his arms. Too light. Jesus Christ. She weighed almost nothing. The moment warmth touched her, the infant quieted immediately, tiny body curling instinctively against his chest. When Daniel looked back up, the alien woman still hadn't moved. But her expression changed. Fear. Not fear for herself. Fear that he would take the child inside and leave her outside in the snow. Daniel swore softly under his breath, then stepped backward and pulled the door wider open. "Get in here," he said roughly. The woman stared at him in disbelief. Wind howled around the porch. Snow whipped through the darkness behind her. Still she hesitated. Like kindness itself had become something suspicious. Daniel ran a tired hand through his hair. "I'm not going to hurt you," he muttered. "But if you stay out there much longer, you're both dead." That finally broke something in her hesitation. Slowly, carefully, she crossed the porch. The second she stepped inside, Daniel shut the door against the storm. Silence flooded the house. Warmth, light, safety. The woman flinched anyway. Daniel noticed everything immediately now that she stood closer. Hollow cheeks. Exhaustion carved deep beneath her eyes. Thin clothing soaked completely through from snow. And scars. Faint silver scars disappearing beneath the collar of her ruined jacket. Or scars. The baby stirred softly in his arms. The mother's eyes snapped toward her instantly. Protective. Terrified. Daniel swallowed awkwardly. "You hungry?" he asked quietly. The woman stiffened. Pride fought visibly against desperation across her face. Then finally, "Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. And somehow that single broken answer hit Daniel harder than the storm outside ever could. The house felt unbearably warm after the storm outside. Heat drifted from the old radiator near the window while melted snow slowly pooled beneath the alien woman's boots. Daniel shut the locks carefully before turning back toward her. She still hadn't moved far from the doorway, like she didn't fully believe she was allowed to stand there. The baby stirred softly against his chest, making tiny exhausted sounds as she curled deeper into his warmth. Daniel swallowed awkwardly. Sit down," he muttered, motioning toward the couch. "You look like you're about to collapse." For a moment, the woman simply stared at him. Suspicious, cautious, like kindness itself had become dangerous. Then finally, her legs gave out before her pride did. She crossed the room slowly and sank onto the couch with visible exhaustion. The second she sat down, Daniel realized just how weak she actually was. Her hands trembled constantly. Her breathing was uneven. And up close, he could see bruises beneath the faded blue skin around her wrists. Old bruises. Something dark twisted in his stomach. Daniel looked away before anger could settle too deeply. The baby whimpered again. Instantly, the woman reached for her. The change in her expression happened so fast, it almost startled him. 1 second she looked terrified. The next, gentle, protective, soft in a way that made the exhaustion on her face somehow even sadder. Daniel carefully handed the infant over. The moment the child touched her mother's arms, she calmed immediately. Tiny claws grabbed weakly at the woman's soaked shirt, while soft clicking sounds escaped her throat. Alien sounds, but unmistakably comfort. The woman closed her eyes briefly, pressing her forehead against the baby's. Daniel looked away again. Something about witnessing that moment felt strangely private. "You need food," he said gruffly. Her golden eyes lifted toward him carefully. "You have already done enough." "Yeah, well," Daniel muttered while moving toward the kitchen, "my conscience disagrees." The kitchen was a disaster. Unwashed dishes, half-empty cabinets, cheap canned food stacked beside old coffee tins. Daniel suddenly became painfully aware of how pathetic his house looked with actual guests inside it. Still, it was warmer than outside, and right now that mattered more. He grabbed the only decent thing he had left. Soup, bread, some leftover chicken from yesterday. Nothing special, but real food. As he worked at the stove, he could feel the woman watching him silently from the couch. The silence between them wasn't comfortable exactly, but it also wasn't hostile anymore. "What's your name?" Daniel asked finally. A pause. Then quietly, "Treya." Daniel nodded once. "I'm Daniel." Treya repeated the name softly, like testing unfamiliar sounds on her tongue. "Daniel." Something about the way she said it made the room feel smaller. The baby suddenly made another weak, crying sound. Treya immediately adjusted her against her chest. Daniel frowned slightly. "She okay?" Treya hesitated. Then her expression shifted into something dangerously close to shame. "She is hungry." Daniel blinked. Then realization hit him all at once. "Oh." Treya immediately looked away. Embarrassed. Humiliated even. Daniel suddenly remembered reading something years ago during the war, that Velari women considered feeding their children an intensely private act. Sacred almost. And now she was trapped inside a stranger's house with nowhere to go. Jesus. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll give you privacy." Treya looked startled by the offer, like she genuinely hadn't expected consideration. Daniel moved quickly toward the hallway, but before turning the corner, he glanced back once. Treya sat curled protectively around the baby, shoulders hunched tightly as she carefully shielded the child against her chest. Even now, even starving, even freezing, her first instinct was protecting her daughter's dignity. Daniel leaned silently against the hallway wall for a moment. Something heavy settled inside his chest. Not pity, something worse. Respect. And that made this entire situation far more dangerous than he wanted to admit. Several minutes later, soft footsteps reached the kitchen entrance. Daniel looked up. Treya stood there holding the sleeping infant carefully against one shoulder. And for the first time since entering the house, she looked slightly less afraid. Slightly. Daniel motioned awkwardly toward the table. "Soup's ready." Treya sat down carefully. The moment the smell reached her, her composure cracked instantly. Daniel saw it in her eyes first. Pure hunger. Not ordinary hunger. The kind that physically hurt. She tried to eat slowly at first. Politely. Carefully. But after the first few bites, survival took over. Her hands shook harder. Breathing uneven. She ate like someone terrified the food might suddenly disappear. Daniel said nothing. Just quietly pushed the rest of the bread closer toward her side of the table. Treya froze briefly at the gesture, then looked up at him. And for the first time, there was something in her golden eyes besides fear. Relief. Daniel couldn't remember the last time another person sat at his kitchen table. The old apartment had spent years drowning in silence. No laughter. No conversation. Just the low hum of appliances and the occasional sound of winter rain against the windows. Now there was warmth in the room. Soft breathing. The faint rustle of blankets where the baby slept against Treya's chest. And somehow, That terrified him more than the storm outside. Treya held the soup bowl carefully in both hands like it was something fragile enough to disappear. The harsh desperation from earlier had faded slightly now that food sat in her stomach, but exhaustion still clung heavily to her body. Daniel noticed she kept glancing toward the front door. Always checking, always listening, like part of her expected someone to break in at any moment. "You don't have to stay tense," he said quietly. Treya's eyes lifted toward him instantly. "I do." The answer came too fast, too automatic. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "How long have you been running?" Treya hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the bowl. "Since the camps closed." Daniel frowned. "What camps?" "The refugee shelters," she whispered. "Most were abandoned after funding stopped." Something cold settled in Daniel's chest. He remembered the news reports years ago. Politicians promising aid, temporary relocation zones, humanitarian protection. Apparently temporary meant disposable. Treya looked down at the sleeping baby. "After the war ended, humans stopped seeing us as victims," she said quietly. "We became reminders." Daniel didn't answer, because she wasn't wrong. Humanity had won the war, but winning hadn't made anyone kinder. The baby shifted softly in her sleep. Tiny clawed fingers curled against Treya's shirt. Daniel watched the movement silently. "What's her name?" he asked. Treya's expression softened instantly. "Ravi." The way she said it carried warmth that hadn't existed in her voice before. Daniel nodded once. "She's beautiful." Treya looked genuinely surprised by the statement, as if nobody had said something kind about her child in a very long time. A strange silence settled between them again. Not awkward this time, just heavy. Outside, snow hammered against the windows while wind screamed through the streets beyond the apartment building. Treya flinched slightly at the sound. Daniel noticed immediately. "You're safe here tonight," he said. Her eyes met his. For a second, Daniel saw something dangerous inside them. Hope. Small. Fragile. The kind that could break people if it disappeared too quickly. Treya lowered her gaze again. "I knocked on 7 doors before yours," she whispered. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. 7. Some pretended not to hear me. Her voice stayed calm, but barely. "Some told me to leave before I could speak." A pause. Then quieter. "One man threatened to report me for trespassing." Daniel clenched his jaw hard enough to hurt. Treya continued staring at the soup bowl. "I almost stopped trying after that." Something about those words hit Daniel directly in the chest. Because if she had stopped trying, Ravi would have died in the snow tonight. The realization made him feel sick. Daniel stood abruptly from the table and walked toward the kitchen counter before his anger showed too clearly on his face. Treya stiffened immediately at the sudden movement. Daniel noticed and instantly regretted it. "Sorry," he muttered. "Just getting more water." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. That tiny reaction bothered him more than he expected. Whoever hurt her before tonight had taught her to fear sudden movements. Daniel filled a glass slowly while trying to control the anger building in his chest. He barely knew this woman, barely knew anything about her. But the thought of her standing outside in that storm while people slammed doors in her face made something violent rise inside him. When he turned back around, Treya was watching him carefully. Not fearfully this time. Curiously. "You are angry," she said softly. Daniel scoffed. "Can you blame me?" Treya looked down at Ravi again. "No," she whispered. "But most humans stopped caring about Velari's suffering a long time ago." Daniel leaned against the counter quietly. "Yeah," he admitted. "Most did." Treya studied him for several long seconds. Then finally, "Why didn't you?" Daniel opened his mouth automatically, then stopped. Because the truth was, he didn't fully know. Maybe it was the baby crying in the snow. Maybe it was the exhaustion in Treya's eyes. Or maybe he simply couldn't stand the idea of becoming another person who closed the door on someone desperate. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I guess," he said quietly. "I just couldn't leave you out there." Treya stared at him. Really stared. And for the first time since entering his house. The fear in her eyes cracked just enough for gratitude to shine through instead. That night, Daniel didn't sleep much. The storm outside had only gotten worse. Wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake the old apartment walls, while snow buried the streets deeper beneath endless white. But that wasn't what kept him awake. It was the silence inside the house. Or more specifically, the fear hiding underneath it. Daniel sat in the living room chair near the window, staring out into the storm with an untouched cup of coffee cooling beside him. Down the hallway, Treya slept lightly in the spare room. Or at least she tried to. Several times during the night, he heard movement. Soft footsteps. The creak of the bedroom floor. The quiet sounds of Ravi crying before immediately being soothed again. Treya never fully relaxed. Even here. Even safe. That bothered him more than he expected. Around 3 in the morning, Daniel heard another sound. Not inside the house. Outside. His body tensed instantly. Slowly, he stood and moved toward the front window without turning on any lights. At first he saw nothing but snow. Then, movement. 2 figures standing across the street beneath the broken glow of a street lamp. Watching the house, Daniel's stomach dropped. They weren't neighbors. He could tell by the way they stood. Too still. Too focused. One of them pointed toward the building briefly before both figures disappeared back into the storm. Daniel swore under his breath. A floorboard creaked softly behind him. Treya stood near the hallway entrance, clutching Ravi tightly against her chest. Golden eyes locked on him immediately. "You saw them too," she whispered. Daniel nodded once. The fear in her expression returned instantly. Raw. Familiar. Like she had spent too many nights expecting this exact moment. "They found us," she said quietly. Daniel rubbed a tired hand across his face. "Maybe not yet. But they are looking." He didn't answer. Because she was right. Treya stepped closer slowly. Ravi slept against her shoulder, completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. "She is why they hunt us," Treya whispered. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Treya hesitated, then carefully pulled the blanket back slightly from Ravi's small arm. Faint, glowing markings shimmered beneath the baby's blue skin. Beautiful. Alien. Almost like moving starlight. Daniel stared. "She was born after the war," Treya said softly. "Very few Velari children survive now." His chest tightened. Treya looked down at her daughter. "She is valuable to them." "What does that mean?" Treya swallowed hard. "It means some humans see her as property." The room went completely silent. Daniel felt something cold spread through his chest. Not fear. Rage. Treya kept speaking quietly. "Refugee children disappear often." Her voice nearly broke. "Especially pure-blood Velari." Daniel's hands clenched into fists instantly. Jesus Christ. He looked toward the storm outside again. Those men weren't random. And suddenly he understood why Treya looked terrified every time someone knocked on the door. Daniel exhaled slowly before turning back toward her. "How long have they been following you?" Treya hesitated. "Since the shelter." "And you didn't tell me?" Her eyes lowered immediately. "I did not want to bring danger into your home." Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "You were freezing to death outside. That does not make this your fight." Something sharp flashed across Daniel's expression. "Too late for that now." Treya looked up at him. The room felt smaller suddenly. Warmer too. Daniel stepped closer carefully. "You and Ravi are staying here tonight," he said firmly. "Tomorrow we figure something out." Treya's grip tightened protectively around the baby. "You do not understand what these men are capable of." "Maybe not," Daniel admitted. "But I know what kind of man I'd become if I threw you back out into that storm." Treya stared at him silently. Then slowly, very slowly, some of the fear in her expression cracked apart. Not completely, but enough. Ravi shifted softly in her sleep between them. Daniel looked down at the child, then back at Treya, and for the first time since opening that door earlier tonight, he realized this situation was no longer temporary. Because somewhere between the storm, the baby, and the terrified alien woman standing barefoot in his living room, Daniel Carter had already made his choice.